Good morning. Welcome to this plenary session on the second day of the Congress on new roles for operators in an urban era. We have a wonderful panel here. We are unfortunately still missing one panelist, but we've decided to start because otherwise maybe the rest of the day is going to be thrown off course a little. To sort of start the sessions today, we wanted to have a plenary that sort of contextualizes the current dynamics that operators face. And hence, Julie Perkins is going to give a little overview of the challenges of current urbanization. And she's doing this in lieu of Andre Drikus, yes, who would have otherwise done this, who is the coordinator of the Urban Basic Services branch at UN Habitat, but who could not be here. He's going to come in later, but he's just too late for this session. So please, Julie, I think everybody knows Julie. She's been at WOPs from the beginning and with UN Habitat for at least 10 years, I think. Julie, please.
Thank you, Rodante. Good morning, everyone. So this session is about living operators' challenges in an urban era, and we really are living in an urban era. Since 2008, more than half of us have been living in cities around the world, and that rate is continuing to grow, particularly in Africa and Asia, of course to a lesser extent in other continents, Latin America and Europe. And much of this growth is happening in small and mid-sized cities. As our executive director said yesterday, the scale is really actually quite mind-blowing. I mean, it represents, in the next 50 years or so, a near doubling of the current urban population. I think it's hard to overestimate the importance that this opportunity presents. It's enormous. We can do this well, or we can do this very badly and create a lot of problems for ourselves. Unfortunately, a lot of the growth that's happening right now in cities is unplanned. Where cities are growing fastest in particular, it's very unplanned. And the vast majority of urbanization is ending up either in slums. In Africa, 70% of urbanization currently is slum urbanization, or in land-intensive urban sprawl. Both slums and sprawl are urban forms that, aside from their social and environmental problems, are extremely expensive and complicated to serve with water and sanitation services, and they need to be avoided. So the first thing to do to mitigate these water problems is actually not directly a water management thing. It's really to anticipate this urban growth. It's really to embrace this urbanization directly as a force of change, first off by planning for it, by planning for increasing densities where urban growth has already taken place, and second, to set aside land for growth that will come to accommodate new urban expansion while protecting the most important features of the watershed. There is a great deal of energy, of course, being put in, and I think many people today will talk about the importance of trying to upgrade slums and provide services in these slum areas. But what I'd really like to emphasize is how fast cities are growing, particularly in Africa and Asia, and these negative urban development patterns are not inevitable by any means. I lived in Nairobi in Kenya for 9 years, and during that time, there was a great focus on a slum called Kibera that many of you may know. It's one of the world's biggest slums, and it gets a lot of attention, and the numbers there are hotly debated. So the official number is 150,000, and some say there are 5 million, so it's not really clear how many live there. But during the time I was there, there was an increase in the urban slum population of Nairobi of around 700,000 people, which means that's basically Kibera just doubled while everyone was looking at it in the outskirts of the city. So the focus is not just on what's there, trying to fix those problems, but preventing those problems by anticipating urbanization. We address not only the manifestations of these problems, but also this underlying systemic issues that, if we can, once corrected, can help us avoid these problems that we have that underlie some of the water management issues that the other panelists, I think, will now address. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Then I would like to invite Barbara to give the next talk. Barbara has been working with ICLE, which are the local governments for sustainability, for over 20 years, and she's now heading the water team within the bigger thematic cluster dealing with sustainable resources, water and resilience at the European Secretariat in Freiburg in Germany. Barbara, please.
The points that or some of the points that need to be taken into consideration when dealing with this enormous dynamics of urbanization follow directly up now, Julie, from what you were saying, because when we talk about water operators, and I guess also when you think about your water operator partnerships, you basically think about proper institutions that are working with each other and exchanging experience, supporting each other with their expertise. But then when it comes to urbanization as it happens in reality, and we really have to look behind the sheer figures and understand very well of where and how urbanization really takes place, where exactly do people move in, and in what kind of situations do they move in. So in most cases, people would come into an environment where water and sanitation services are already a challenge, where they have not been solved properly, where people are already struggling with getting the services that they need. And thus the problem is dramatically increased. But still, even in these not planned environments, urban environments, people do obviously have water because there's a lot of small-scale informal operators. So somehow there's maybe certain self-help mechanisms, individuals or mini businesses that somehow still serve the area with their services. So I think when we are now talking about urbanization and these dynamics that are going on and how to deal with it, we have to take into account that we get a very good picture of what the informal services in these unplanned settlements are, and not to ignore them, but really map them properly, see what the needs are, and integrate them into more formally planned, more comprehensively planned service provision. So that's one thing, and I guess there's a lot about planning, and of course we wish to have nice plans and build on plans and the understanding of the situation, how to approach and manage these services. But at the same time, this planning has to be very, very flexible, because it's not so sure what will happen next year, how the figures will develop, maybe where the next movement of population coming into a city is going, and so on. So the situation is, I guess, in many situations rather chaotic, and the informal sector has to be well recognized and a good mapping of the situation, of the needs, of the future situation to come has to be in place. This also applies, my second point is very closely connected to the first one, because it also means that there will be a lot of new individuals or small entrepreneurs figuring out that there's interesting maybe business cases to make. People just need water. So, and many people pay quite a high price in these informal areas for water, a lot more than people in the nice areas of town. Again, it is important to coordinate, and in many cases there must be a coordination mechanism, And I see here the local authority in a very important role to bring those different players together and really understand who is doing what, and making sure that, you know, not everyone is just doing a small thing within the bigger picture without coordination, but really to talk with each other, to share tasks, roles and responsibilities, and it's still a very challenging task certainly ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I would like to keep questions until the end, so give all the panelists the chance to present their point, and then we can have a discussion together at the end. So then I would like to move on to Dr. Kala Vairava-Murthy, who is now working at IMI, at the International Water Management Institute, as practice leader for applied research and knowledge transfer, but who's also professor at the University of South Florida in the USA. Please.
Thank you very much, Rodenta. Good morning, everyone. I would like to stress, the importance for us to change the way in which we do urban water management. I mean, traditionally, what we've done is we've applied sort of very much 19th century principles. We have these linear systems where we take water from afar, bring it to a city, we use it once, we use one quality for everything, and then we again move it very, very far away and dump it. And this type of approach is really something that was developed for the West. We've tried to adopt that in developing countries. It's unaffordable for most developing countries. And I think in light of some of the global change pressures that Julie highlighted, we need to rethink the way in which we manage water. And I think the key thing about managing urban water is really the perspective that we have. And I think we need to think much, much more about the productive use of water. What is it we want the water to do for us? This idea that as populations grow, the only solution is to import more and more water to a city, which leads to sort of very large, capital-intensive, highly intrusive types of infrastructure projects, is I think, an outdated way of thinking. And when we start thinking about the productive use of water, what is it, what quantity and quality of water do we need for a particular use? We're then in the position to start matching qualities for different intended uses. So for drinking, we need a certain quality. For gardening, we need a slightly different quality. For flushing our toilets, we need a different quality. And I think key to that perspective, that productive use perspective, is having a much more integrated framework in when we view the water cycle. The water sector is very fragmented, but actually what you need to do is to view it through a much more sort of integrated perspective. So you're looking at your drinking water cycle, your used water cycle, your stormwater cycle, you're looking at them collectively, and you're looking at all water within that framework as good water, but just tailored for different types of uses. So when you look at used water, you might have grey water that could be used for certain purposes. You could have black water after some treatment that could be used. And I think that that's really a major shift in our thinking, this idea of matching quality and quantity to an intended use. There's been a lot of innovations in technology, particularly in the area of wastewater management with, particularly membranes, and there's lots of advancements in terms of super smooth membranes. There's a lot of material science work going on. But for me, again, from the technology perspective, it's about perspective as well. And, this idea of thinking, when we stand downstream and look upstream at properties that are discharging waste, this idea of thinking of it as a burden is changed dramatically. And now people are seeing this stuff that's coming out of people's houses as having lots of value. So there's a lot of calorific value there potentially, so we could capture that and produce energy, either electricity or heat. There's nutrients embedded in those streams, so we can capture that and put it to some productive use. And of course, there's a lot of water. There's 99.99% of that's water. So when we're in a water stress situation, how can we extract from these streams and use that water again? And this is happening in many, many countries. And even you've got countries that are creating designer waters. They're buying wastewaters from cities and then producing different grades of water for different uses. Now, when we start thinking of all of these clever things in the water cycle, scale starts to play a very important role. And you're seeing there's a move towards having much smaller areas of influence, if you like, in terms of the water cycle. People are realizing that water's heavy, and moving it long distances and then trying to move it back to a city is very energy intensive. So size starts to matter, and people see that scales of about 30 to 50,000 inhabitants is really a good scale to work with. So you see this move to a much more decentralized approach to urban water management. And I think it's important in this context here, because you see, it requires a big transition for utilities, right? It's very hard. They deal with large infrastructure systems, huge amounts of legacy, lots of sunk cost, a very irrational sort of connection with those sunk costs. So how do they change? How do they move to this new sort of way of thinking? And what's interesting, and it sort of connects with what Barbara says, is, there's a very good analogy by Malcolm Gladwell where he talks about David and Goliath. And he says that, when you analyze the story, Goliath is always going to lose, because Goliath is this very large guy who is not agile. He can't see too far into the future. He doesn't have the capacity to respond very quickly. Whereas David is got one particular weapon. He's very small, he's very agile, and he's able to adapt very quickly. And you see a very similar analogy with water utilities, right? And they have to sort of recognize that they are very large. They do find it very difficult to change. But you've got these small-scale operators now who are beginning to serve those people that haven't been served. And they're doing it in this clever way where they're thinking about productive use. They're looking at capturing value from the different waste streams. And they're slowly entering into the market. And I think that the utilities have to be aware of this and be prepared to respond to that. And, it also brings me to Clayton Christensen, where he talks about disruption. And what he says is that disruption happens when the big players ignore people who are underserved. And you get these small operators that come into the market and start serving at a very low level these underserved communities, and the big players ignore it because they think there's not a market for them. But then these small-scale guys start to perfect what they do. They start to optimize all these processes, and then they go into the next layer, and then they start overtaking the next layer of market, and they continue to do this until they penetrate the entire market. And I think you're seeing elements of this already impacting the water sector. So for me, I think the utilities have to be aware of some of these changes and think about how they can effectively transition and move away from the 19th century way of doing water management to a sort of a 21st century of doing water management. That concludes my intervention.
Thank you very much. Next, thank you very much. Next up is Christiane Frank. Are you ready, given that you've just entered the room? All right, then I would like to invite Christiane Frank. She is the general manager of Vivagua, one of the major public water companies in Belgium, in Brussels, and is chief executive officer of Agua Pública Europea, the European Association of Public Water Operators. Thank you, Christiane.
Thank you. Bien, comme la session se déroule aussi en français, je vais parler français. J'ai retenu 4 sujets que je vais brièvement évoquer en matière de problématiques qui se présentent aux opérateurs de l'eau dans les milieux urbains. Le premier est propre aux villes d'Europe en particulier qui sont confrontées à des périodes de pluie. Et la Belgique, comme vous le savez, est un pays qui connaît des périodes de pluie intenses, comme les pays environnants. Et donc, une problématique qui se présente à nous, qui se présente aux acteurs de l'eau, est la lutte contre les inondations. La lutte contre les inondations, et vous savez sans doute que même dans des pays comme la Chine, on se retrouve confronté à une mortalité importante lors de périodes d'inondation. Il y a quelques années, au mois de juillet, la Chine a eu un 21 juillet une journée de très forte pluie où, à Pékin, des dizaines, voire des centaines de personnes sont mortes, noyées dans les rues de Pékin à cause d'inondations. Cette problématique, elle se résout comment en Belgique et à Bruxelles en particulier? par la création de bassins d'orage. Ce sont donc des bassins tampons où l'eau réside avant de pouvoir calmement s'écouler dans les égouts après avoir été stockée temporairement. Problématique qui se présente, c'est que pour créer ces bassins, on génère une paralysie du secteur en ouvrant les voiries et donc en empêchant la circulation dans ces voiries. Et donc nous avons imaginé à Bruxelles une technique innovante qui est de remplacer cette technique de création de bassins, donc d'immenses citernes tampons, par une structure différente, c'est-à-dire de créer des énormes tuyaux par une technique de tunnelier. Donc ce sont des tunneliers qui creusent en dessous de la route, sans ouvrir la route en particulier, mais en créant deux chambres d'accès, l'une en amont, l'autre en aval, et qui creusent la route pour creuser d'énormes tuyaux qui vont se substituer au bassin tampon, au bassin d'orage. Et nous sommes en train de créer à Bruxelles un tunnel de ce type qui va faire 25 000 mètres cubes. Donc vous imaginez que ça crée quand même un tampon important pour une période, pour une grosse pluie, pour contrer une inondation possible. Voilà une première problématique dont je voulais vous parler. Et en annexe à cette problématique, je voulais vous dire aussi qu'au sein de Vivaquois, nous avons créé un service d'aide à la population par rapport aux inondations que nous avons appelé simplement le Conseil Inondation ou encore Monsieur Inondation, où nous proposons un service à la population, un service payant à la population, où nous allons examiner la situation de l'habitation et où nous voyons si l'habitation, si la structure interne de l'habitation ne peut pas être améliorée pour justement empêcher l'inondation des caves, l'inondation des parties basses de l'habitation. Donc ça, c'est un deuxième aspect de notre démarche par rapport à la lutte contre les inondations. Une deuxième facette tout à fait différente que je voulais vous proposer, c'est la problématique des acteurs de l'eau, en particulier dans la ville, face au vieillissement des conduites et, parallèlement à ça, face à l'application du prix vérité imposé par la Commission européenne. Dans la plupart des villes européennes, nous avons commencé à installer les conduites de distribution d'eau et par la suite les conduites d'assainissement au début, dans la première partie du siècle passé. Ce qui veut dire que ces conduites atteignent maintenant un âge certain qui va de 70 à voire 100, même plus de 100 ans. Et donc ces conduites qui ont une très grande longévité sont quand même de plus en plus confrontées à des problèmes de fuite et à des problèmes de remplacement, à une nécessité de remplacement de ces conduites. Est confrontée à ça la problématique du prix vérité imposé par la Commission européenne et au-delà de ça, la problématique de la crise économique qui fait que l'application de ce prix vérité joint à cette augmentation de l'imposition technique de remplacement des conduites fait qu'on se trouve confronté à une augmentation galopante du prix de l'eau si on veut tenir compte de tous les éléments qui entrent dans la composition du prix vérité. Donc c'est une deuxième particularité dans les grandes villes qui ont été très proactives dans la pose des conduites dans la première partie du siècle passé. Alors, en corollaire à ça, comment agir par rapport à la présence de plus en plus grande dans nos villes, dans nos pays européens, de ménages de plus en plus précarisés justement par la crise économique, au point que, je ne sais pas comment ça se passe dans vos villes, dans vos pays, mais dans un pays comme la Belgique, qui est un pays riche à proprement parler, dans une ville comme Bruxelles, qui est une ville riche, on est saisi du nombre de ménages même d'origine belge, je ne parle même pas de ménages d'origine immigrée, qui n'arrivent plus à payer leur facture d'eau, alors que cette situation n'existait pas il y a 5 ou 10 ans. Donc, impact de la crise économique, impact, comme je le disais, de l'augmentation du prix de l'eau. Et donc, nous avons mis en place un tarif que nous avons appelé un tarif solidaire pour lutter contre cette précarité et pour faire en sorte que les familles les plus modestes puissent continuer à avoir accès au seul produit indispensable à la vie, qui est l'eau. Et ce tarif solidaire est un tarif qui, en Belgique, nous avons connaissance, grâce à l'existence d'un registre national, nous avons connaissance du nombre et de l'identité des personnes qui résident dans chaque logement, dans chaque entité de logement. Et donc, grâce à cette connaissance qui nous est donnée par le registre national, nous pouvons déterminer le nombre de personnes par logement, et alors nous offrons par logement les 15 premiers mètres cubes à un prix excessivement bas qui permet aux ménages, aux familles même très pauvres, d'avoir accès à l'eau. Ce qui veut dire que les familles pauvres qui n'ont pas de lave-vaisselle, qui n'ont pas de technologie ménagère, peuvent, avec 15 mètres cubes par personne, pourvoir à leurs besoins essentiels en eau. Les 15 mètres cubes suivants, donc ces 15 mètres cubes sont appelés la tranche vitale, puisque ça permet à la personne de vivre avec 15 mètres cubes par an. Les 15 mètres cubes suivants sont appelés la tranche sociale et sont à un prix un peu plus élevé, mais encore très accessible. Et puis, on monte graduellement dans les tranches suivantes pour arriver à des prix qui sont, eux, nettement supérieurs au prix moyen de distribution de l'eau. Et justement, pourquoi est-il solidaire? Parce que c'est une manière pour les personnes qui consomment beaucoup, c'est-à-dire qui, a priori, sont des personnes aisées, d'aider les personnes qui consomment peu, qui, a priori, sont des personnes modestes, à avoir en permanence accès à l'eau. Et quatrième et dernier...
Christian, can I ask you to close
to
up,
close.
to
Well,
give
I will
the other
close.
panelists
The
a
last
chance?
one. It's the last one. Dernier élément, toujours dans cette lutte contre la précarité que je voulais aborder, c'était que nous avons décidé à Bruxelles, dans chaque mètre cube vendu, de consacrer 3 cents à des projets pour le Sud, pour nos amis des pays du Sud qui ont des problèmes pour l'accès à l'eau. Donc 3 cents par mètre cube sont dédicacés à des projets dans les pays du Sud. Voilà, ceci termine mon intervention.
Thank you very much. We will now proceed to Marianne Schelein? There you go. The director of the Water Governance Facility at SIWI in Stockholm and also head of the Water Governance team at the center. Please.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Well, we have heard about the urban growth, which is tremendous. It's a combination of growth and also the juxtaposition of stark contrasts and inequalities. But first, I'd just like to emphasize the opportunity that is presented by this, the growth and the economic growth that also we see in urban areas. I think somehow it needs to be welcomed, and the issue really to address is the quality of the growth, I think, as also mentioned by Julie. It is really to welcome the growth, but ensure that it's going in a direction which is more sustainable. I think this involves also building more on water's natural flows or harmonize with nature in terms of flows and circulation, and also build on the nice fact that many of the new generations or the newcomers or people that are growing up and we have greater wealth, and there are people that will be actually demanding higher quality service for everybody. So I think there is also great opportunities in both in the capacity of the people and also the recognizing that most of tomorrow's cities is yet to be built, that there is a chance to actually do it much better and also implement some of those things that we know are wiser. I'd like to outline 3 main challenges, as I see it, for operators in this new urban era. The first challenge It's an old one. It relates to the full service coverage. I think the deprivation presented by not having good access to water services remains the priority number one. It involves the reorientation of how we invest. Sometimes it's less in the larger scale abstractions and relatively more, for example, into distribution system. Distribution is high cost activity, but it's in many areas grossly underfunded, which makes large areas of the cities and large proportions of the populations that don't have access to the public system. They will have access to other means that are much more expensive. But there is great opportunity and I think a challenge to actually increase the service coverage and quality of services. It's a running target for many cities, low-income cities with rapid urban growth, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. It is really a running target. But in other areas like Latin America, full coverage is really within reach. Also in Europe, I think there are some new challenges actually with economic crisis and homelessness, where I think in many times they're quite ill-prepared to deal with these challenges, and actually addressing the problem tends to be caught up in institutional issues about who's responsible. But I think for the bottom line here, or the reorientation to achieve full coverage, I think it needs a reallocation of resources from generally a high income to a low income. There is no reason why there should be less investment per capita in low income areas than in high income areas. So there is a reorientation, which I think it's a political challenge, really, to allow this to take place. The second challenge I'd like to outline is also about reorientation, but more relating to the types of systems. The linear, the circular, or the centralized, decentralized. And I think Kala was speaking a lot about this. As cities are growing and the demand for services and goods is growing at even faster, and cities cannot just continue to go further afield and exploit even more distant sources. And to supply a sort of infinite system demand, and at least when there are leaks, actually the system can demand infinite volumes of water. So to really tighten the whole control of the system, and also to the reuse and recirculation. And in this case, not just reuse of water within the system, but also of energy, of nutrients, and all our resources before they're being released into the sea or the atmosphere. And here, this might also need, it's happening, but it also requires new thinking. And I think maybe the redefinition of how we talk about waste. Wastewater, is it really waste? It's a resource. So there also, I think, some rethinking and redefinition of terms. The final challenge I'd like to outline, it relates to integration, responsibilities, and concerns. But I think many operators have been, there are increasing demands on operators of utilities. In the last few decades, environmental requirements are much higher, much more stringent. The full coverage goal is being taken more seriously. With the human right to water and sanitation and the Sustainable Development Agenda, we're looking into 2030 at least as a more realistic goal for full coverage. And this actually, it's being required of utilities around the world to fulfill these expectations. So, and I think for operators, it is important to keep up with this higher level of expectations. It requires to assume responsibility and be accountable in those areas of the responsibility. So increase expertise and competence within its own field. It's happening, and it must continue. At the same time, operators need to be concerned what happens beyond their own mandate. And this relates both to issues of equity and the environment. And to look beyond their mandate, for example, in low-income areas, post-tap contamination, what happens in the households after the water is handed over from the operator to the household? It might not be the direct responsibility of the operator, but it must be of their concern. The care must go further. Also the catchment management and urban landscaping, it might not be the direct responsibility of the operator, but the operators must engage in a fruitful discussion about these issues and be concerned. So this speaks also for integration. And that is really to voice these concerns and be part of a more strategically planned future. Operators need to be part of this integrated urban planning and water management, where the broader social, environmental, and economic concerns are included in the thinking beyond the responsibility of each actor. So I think for the role or expectation on operators in this new urban area is to continue to improve competence and expertise in their own area, but also to be even more involved in shaping the future for the common good of the whole of society. So I think that's a real challenge, and I hope that's the way we are moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. And finally, I would like to invite Dinesh Mehta, who is professor at the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology University and is currently the director of a Melinda Gates performance assessment project that involves over 400 operators in India.
Thank you. Part of the problem of speaking at the end of a panel is that most of your points are already discussed. So I was sitting here noting down. So I said, let me take you back 20 years. I was invited by UN Habitat back in 1995 to when we were before the Istanbul conference. And many of you know the Habitat 2 in Istanbul in 96, and there'll be Habitat 3 in Quito in October next year. But when we were invited as outsiders to help UN Habitat draft the Habitat agenda, we wanted to call it the city agenda in 96. And there was great opposition from member states from Africa and Asia. My own country, India, was very opposed to calling that as city agenda because they said, oh no, you cannot call it the city agenda because 80% of our population in our country still live in villages and rural, so you have to keep it as Habitat agenda. So we had to, instead of calling UN Habitat the city agency of the UN and calling that Habitat 2 as the city agenda, we had to call it the Habitat agenda. Over 20 years, we see a great turnaround, and for the fact that all my panelists have argued, you look at the SDG process, the Sustainable Development Goal process, for the first, and there was a group of people who wanted a separate goal for cities. So while you all talk about the goal 6 of the SDG, you must also recognize that there is goal 11 of cities. And that goal was well recognized, and the fact that we have all said that the world has already turned urban, more than 50% of population is urban, and we do need to look at cities more specifically and not as a part of other themes. What does the goal 11 talk about? Goal 11 says making cities inclusive, resilient, safe, and sustainable. And this is something that has links to our discussion today. Making cities inclusive is all about reaching out to those who do not have access to services. Most water operators working in developing countries are reluctant to move into low-income areas. They have issues of network penetration, they have issues of affordability, tariff. Most operators leave it at what's very common in Africa is to have a kiosk where poor can get water. A few cities, and I have friends from Durban here in this audience, eThekwini, whatever it is, new name called. Some of the cities in Asia are now moving beyond this notion, getting pipe network into the low-income communities, and demonstrating that the poor can also pay. And in fact, they are able to pay because currently they are anyway paying much more than the non-poor. And so I think the challenge for, as we become more urban, as the city population grows, we have to recognize that the lower income population will remain, and in fact there may be more of those groups of people who will need the service. How do we extend service coverage to them? I have issues with JMP, the way it measures water access, because even a community tap or a common standpipe is considered as access to water. So we all think that the water problem of the MDG is resolved, but I don't think that's true. There is issues of, we work in, as she said, 400 cities where we are measuring performance level, service level. We find cities in India which supply water once in 10 days. And that water is also available only for 1 hour. Now, there's no way we can call that as good access of service. But this is because it's ticked in the JMP list because you have a tap. Whether there is water in that tap, whether that water is fit to drink, I don't think those were the concerns in the old JMP. The new SDGs are now challenging us, all the operators, to ensure greater coverage, to ensure high quality of service. And I think this challenge is going to continue to be much more. The second part of the point, goal 11, is talking about making cities resilient. And I thought, Barbara, you would have mentioned that because I know ECLE is doing a great deal of work on cities and climate change. Over the few years, we are going to see tremendous changes in the whole water cycle, in the way in which the water resources are going to be. I mean, people have talked about it, but we have already begun to see different forms of water stresses. Areas that were relatively water rich are soon becoming water scarce, and vice versa. Areas which were water scarce are now talking about floods. How do we handle this situation? These are larger issues than what an operator would deal with, but I think we need to be concerned about. We need to ask ourselves the question that, are we prepared in the next 20 years to handle the climate change situation? If there is different water paradigm, I mean, is there a different water paradigm that we need to be worried about? And my final point is something that we are beginning to work, and many operators are reluctant to get into, is the whole sanitation space. Water, sanitation are linked issues. Many operators do not as yet talk about sanitation-related issues. And that's right from the whole sanitation chain that we are now beginning to discover. In India now, the new government has a program of providing a toilet to everybody. And some of you may have seen recent numbers. India is the, what do we call it? Open defecation capital of the world. 500 million people defecating in the open. And the government now says, in next 5 years, we will have a toilet in every house. Now, that's a huge challenge. And we have asked this question that having a toilet in every house is a great thing, but what happens next? Where does it go? How do we take it out, and how do we talk about safe treatment? And I think these are the issues that many operators have not yet begun to handle, because water operators think that our task is to deliver water. But often public operators need to look at both water and sanitation, wastewater situation together. And I think wastewater treatment, handling sanitation waste is, in my opinion, the biggest challenge for the next 20 years in our part of the world. So I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Now I would like to give it over to the audience. If there are any questions for the panelists, please. Above, do we have any microphones up there, or do you have a loud voice?
Hello, I'll repeat, I think. My name is Speedy Mudlia. I'm from eThekwini municipality. I agree with the professor in the statement that he's made on wastewater treatment works. Wastewater treatment works is a complex process, and it is going to be a challenge in the future. The present challenge that we're having is that when wastewater treatment works are designed to accept 800 COD, and we overload the wastewater treatment works to 2,000, 2,500 COD, accepting the noxious effluent from industries, etc. And that affects our processes. And what we do is then we're non-compliant and we discharge into the estuarine, then affecting the biota of the estuarine. Our big problem is having capacitating the operators so they will be able to look at different situations and adjust the processes accordingly. I just wanted to know what are the comments from the panel in terms of capacitating operators in wastewater treatment works.
Yes, I'll take a few more questions. Was this question directed, do you want an answer from a particular panelist or from whoever is willing to take it on? All right, great. Do we have any other questions? Yes, right in front over here, please.
Merci, mon nom c'est Mamadou Dia, je suis le président de Aquafed et directeur eau et assainissement de Eranov. On a parlé un peu de renouvellement de réseau. Ma question est toute simple. Est-ce que le fait, parce qu'aujourd'hui en Europe, des millions de mètres cubes de pertes sont enregistrés du fait de la vétusté des réseaux. Est-ce qu'il y a eu des plans de renouvellement pertinents pour pouvoir juguler cette situation ou est-ce que c'est parce que la tarification était mal adaptée et qui ne permettait pas de faire un renouvellement régulier pour ne pas arriver à cette situation? Ma deuxième question, c'est quelle stratégie pour la prise en compte des zones périurbaines particulièrement touchées par le recul de l'accès à l'eau potable du fait d'une urbanisation galopante et mal maîtrisée.
I'm assuming your first question was for Christiane Frank, and your second question is for the whole panel? All right. I'm going to take two more questions, and I'm going to ask everybody to restrict themselves to one question. Yes, in the back.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Catherine Baron, je suis professeure des universités à Toulouse. Moi, je travaille sur la problématique de l'accès à l'eau dans les quartiers dits précaires, pas slums, quartiers précaires du Burkina et du Niger. Et moi, j'ai deux petites questions. C'est-à-dire, dans les travaux de recherche que l'on mène, on voit qu'il y a un lien très fort entre les enjeux de sécurité foncière et l'accès aux services de base. Donc on a peu parlé ici de cette problématique de la sécurisation foncière. Ce qu'on voit, nous, dans nos travaux, c'est qu'en fait, les gens bougent, partent vers des quartiers dits slums, parce que ce qu'ils cherchent, avant tout, c'est être propriétaires et assurer une certaine sécurité avant même d'accéder aux services de base. Donc ça, c'est la première chose. La deuxième chose, c'est que je remercie Madame Barbara pour son intervention, parce que je pense qu'il y a une grande complexité qu'il faudrait mieux documenter peut-être dans l'hétérogénéité des ménages dans ces quartiers dits précaires, dits slums. Effectivement, ceux qui ont accès aux petits opérateurs privés ou aux opérateurs informels, ce sont ce qu'on appelle la low prosperity, la petite prospérité dans ces quartiers. Mais les ménages les plus précaires, eux, ils n'ont même pas les moyens d'accéder à ces services dits informels. Et ça, c'est très peu documenté, en fait, dans la littérature. On a l'impression qu'il y a une espèce d'homogénéité dans ces quartiers, et l'hétérogénéité est peu mise en évidence. Donc moi, c'est ces deux points. J'aimerais savoir comment est-ce que vous traitez ces questions du point de vue opérationnel. Merci.
For the last question, who are you directing the question to concerning your last question? To anybody? All right. The last question.
Good morning. My name is Faraj El-Awar from GWOP UN Habitat. At UN Habitat, we always call for water planning through urban planning. And Marianne talked about cities that have not been built yet. So can we really plan for water through urban planning? What do you think about the feasibility of this? I mean, we really believe in it, but what other panelists think about it? And the other issue, we always call also for integrated urban water management. And within the integrated urban water management, there is also kind of an agreement on decentralization. So what do the panelists think about decentralization versus equity? Because we are really concerned about starting some like good serviced islands within big seas of unserved people. So how can we deal with this through decentralized management and technology approaches? This is an open question also for anybody who would like to answer that.
Thank you. I have to also ask if are there any people in the other room? ¿Dónde está el operador? Si hay preguntas de la otra sala. No, there are no questions from the other room? We see them on the bag. All right. I see one very last question in the back, and that's when we're going to hand it over to the panelists to respond.
Rabia Mukhtar, Texas A&M University. There was a lot of interesting points looking into the challenges that the operators will have to face. But I don't see a lot of discussions on are we equipping the operators with the right tools, with the right training, in a specific term to deal with these challenges as they are to face a lot of competition from competing demands from various sectors, changes in demography of the population increases. So we're dumping on them, on their shoulder, a lot of challenges, but I don't see discussions with how do they do it? And they're left alone with an array of challenges, and there's a lot of resources within the UN system and within the academia that can help, but there is no mechanism for these institutions to engage the operators.
All right, thank you. I have 6 main questions, and I'm going to ask all the panelists to shortly, succinctly reply or give their opinion, and you can choose which question you want to address in particular. The first one concerns wastewater overloading, and in particular capacity building to be able to do this better in the future. The second one about the older networks and the renewing of networks. The third one concerns strategies for peri-urban development. The fourth one concerns water access and improving it, the link of water access with property, and also the issue of heterogeneity of the population in informal settlements, and the heterogeneity of server provision, I'm assuming. The fifth one concerns water planning and urban planning, and how to deal with the issue of decentralization with regards to equity. And then the final one is what are mechanisms to equip operators to deal with all these challenges. I'd like to start at the very end. Christiana, can I ask you to start?
Ok, mais je vais peut-être d'abord répondre à la question qui m'était adressée par le président d'Aquafed au niveau des causes des fuites et du lien éventuel entre l'importance des fuites en Europe. Je pense que l'importance des fuites en Europe, je pense qu'il n'y a pas que l'Europe qui est confrontée à des fuites sur les réseaux, mais enfin bon, et le lien éventuel avec la tarification. J'ai moi-même analysé dans les pays européens, en particulier en Belgique, en France, en Italie, en Angleterre, la corrélation qui pouvait exister entre le mode de gestion. Bon, désolé, je m'adresse au président d'Aquafed, mais je vais lui révéler ce que mon analyse particulière sur la corrélation a donné, la corrélation entre le mode de gestion et le taux de fuite. Et on se rend quand même compte que dans les modes de gestion qui sont ceux qui sont pratiqués en France où les communautés urbaines confient la gestion à des structures privées pour une durée déterminée, mais sans confier la responsabilité des investissements. Donc confie simplement l'entretien à des structures privées. Ou en Angleterre, par exemple, où un bel exemple était celui de Londres quand Wastewater était en charge de la gestion de l'eau à Londres, eh bien, on se rend compte qu'il y a une dispersion de la responsabilité et que chacun se dit que l'autre s'occupe du réseau et que personne ne s'engage vraiment dans la rénovation profonde du réseau. On s'occupe de l'entretien, donc des petites réparations, mais on ne s'occupe pas vraiment de prendre en charge l'entretien fondamental du réseau. Par opposition aux structures où le secteur public est en charge du réseau et c'est pour ça que je me suis excusée dès le départ devant le président d'Aquafed, mais c'est une étude statistique. Il faut savoir que j'ai une base mathématique, donc j'ai fait une étude de corrélation mathématique. Et dans ces structures où le public est en charge, le public a une gestion en bon père de famille de l'ensemble de son patrimoine et se dit que, au-delà de la dimension de return financier, il a un patrimoine qu'il doit entretenir. Et il est le seul gestionnaire. On n'est pas devant une situation où il y a un gestionnaire entretien et un gestionnaire investissement. Et donc, le secteur public va aller vers un entretien fondamental aussi bien qu'un entretien, donc un entretien versus investissement versus petit entretien. Voilà, ça c'est une considération qui fait que les taux de fuite sont, je me souviens qu'à l'époque, il y a donc une dizaine d'années, on avait une consommation à Londres de 500 litres par habitant. Ce n'était pas parce que les Londoniens se lavaient plus ou arrosaient plus leur jardin, 500 litres par habitant par rapport à Paris ou Bruxelles qui consommaient 150 litres par habitant et par jour. Donc c'était simplement une cause qui était le fait qu'un calcul économique montrait qu'il était plus intéressant financièrement d'admettre les fuites par rapport à engager des montants importants dans les investissements par rapport au réseau. Pour ce qui est de la question, je vais choisir une autre question par rapport à la gestion des eaux usées. En ce qui concerne la capitale de l'Europe, à savoir Bruxelles, nous avons opté pour une gestion du cycle complet de l'eau, c'est-à-dire que l'acteur de l'eau gère depuis la production jusqu'au traitement des eaux usées. Donc nous gérons le cycle complet de l'eau. Nous avons résolu le problème de cette façon. Voilà.
Okay, I'm gonna ask each panelist to just choose one question to address and keep it very, very short because we've been asked to move on to the next session. So very, very short, very succinct, just one question.
Yeah, thanks, Renate. I was actually just going to use my role as also trying to be a timekeeper to say that there are many interesting questions, but I'm going to just forego my role for the sake of time because I see Martin giving me the eye over there. So, but please, and leave it to the other panelists.
Okay, thank you. I'll just use the opportunity to say, let me just start. I think the importance of training and capacity building. I think it was a question, and I think it hasn't maybe been given a sufficient importance here. Of course, it is people in the utilities and operators that are the people that do the work, and I think that also the study shows that investment in the human resource is really one of the key factors for good performance and efficiency for public or private operators likewise. So here, but also I think that it need not only be sort of external training. There are these on-the-job trainings with standard operating procedures that are valid for actual operations are extremely important. And I think that was also the point was also made by the person from eThekwini about also the need for capacity in terms of wastewater. And there I think also, just to add that there are, I mean, we have to live with multiple systems, both centralized and decentralized, being increasing challenge of coordination including different technical solutions. So they're also dealing with wastewater. We also need to deal with solid waste and fecal sludge management, and really how these systems fit together and support one another. And again, they operate with the basis of what is there in reality, to really find out what is there and build our plans from where we stand rather than in an ideal. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly to respond to Speedy's question, I think one of the problems that we've faced in developing countries is that we've constantly extended our centralized systems. We have a centralized core that was built by the colonialists, and as urban areas grow, we just keep extending that centralized system, and it doesn't really have the capacity to deal with the growing population. And I think the future is really around sort of trying to ring fence our centralized system, our old centralized system, and then to look at these emerging areas in the peripheries as sort of clusters where we can offer different types of solutions. And I think in Durban, they have sort of approached that in a certain way. They've created a sort of a belt. Beyond that belt, they're looking for different solutions rather than connecting people into the centralized system. And I think the same applies for peri-urban areas. The problem is that we're always extending our centralized system to meet those peri-urban areas. But actually, peri-urban areas offers huge opportunities for things like nutrient recovery, because urban agriculture can take place in those peripheries. Rural areas are there where we can co-digest some of the food waste with wastewater to produce energy. There are lots of interesting potential around these peri-urban areas, and I don't think the most appropriate solution is connecting them into the larger centralized system.
Right, I would like to make really symbolically the point that I'm not addressing any single question, because I think the important thing is to bring all these questions together. So I see water management really as a key function within the city, and it's all about really doing urban planning and urban development in an integrative, a flexible, adaptive and participatory manner. So water in itself has different elements which have to be combined. Water links to climate change, water links to social issues, water links to energy issues, and so on. Without an actor, a spider in the web that is overseeing the role of water within the entire urban and peri-urban context, and brings all the players together, water users, water managers, big and small, formal and informal, it won't work. So my big message that I want to leave behind is that we need strong local authorities, public authorities that convene those that are involved with water management and the big users of water, and address all these issues that you've brought up in single questions in an integrated and holistic manner. Thank you.
Yeah, a quick response in terms of governance. In parts of India where I have worked, many local authorities have de-linked tenure issues. That is, you need not be owner of your house or land to get a water connection or a sewage connection. And this is the way they have handled situation in the low-income areas or the squatter settlement, where they do not have the rights and land, papers, ownership, etc. So it's de-linked, and I think this seems to have worked in states where they have done it. We see increase in access to individual water supply and sewage connection manifold. And so the legal barriers are de-linked. Another way in which they have handled the issue is that any new development that happens outside the service area of the operator service area, which is more than 500 families, the developer has to ensure water services as well as wastewater treatment on that premise. So Faraz is right. What has happened as a result is that the load on the operators have decreased, but you have now suddenly found these enclaves of high services, high infrastructure systems. But these are all decentralized, but they are leading to very special inequities. The lower income settlement that come without any formal developer do not have these facilities. And I think this is a challenge that we are now grappling with and ensuring how local operator will need to extend services to these areas. But that's, I think, a challenge.
All right. Thank you very much, all of the panelists. Thank you very much for all of your very interesting questions. I think here I'm going to do my little two-bit thing, is that at the end of the day, we want to redefine water use, productivity, and waste. We have to make those decisions. And if we do want to end up with full service coverage, we have to want to decide, and we have to make these decisions to actually service these low-income areas, whether that is decentralized or not. And I think currently a lot of the water is flowing to areas which are not necessarily low income, and I think we have to redirect those flows to those low-income areas, and those are political decisions that need to be made. Thank you very much, and sorry.